Generally, when it comes to sequels to beloved pre-existing franchises, the immediate question that tends to follow its release is almost always, does it live up to when the series was good? Will Jurassic World be as well executed as Jurassic Park? Can The Force Awakens possibly respect its audience in a way that The Empire Strikes Back did? You get the idea. Funny thing about the Mad Max series though, I'm not really sure it was ever that good to begin with. I mean, I get why it has its fans and is a well-known, generally well-received trilogy, but have you actually sat down to watch all three recently? Is it just me, or is it all just a bit meh? Mad Max 1 to me has always seemed like a B-movie that never quite realised how likely it'd be to find itself winding up on things like Best of the Worst, so instead of relishing in its own campy badness, takes the self-serious route and becomes nothing other than a chore to watch. I understand it was essentially an under-budget attempt at pursuing high-concept action, which to its credit did have some decent car stunts and there's certainly a lot to admire in that, but damn if the overall quality doesn't just render those noble intentions null and void. The dialogue is poor, there's no rhythm to the pacing, the editing is off, and the narrative is essentially one dragged out origin story that does nothing other than set the sequel up to be much better because it will have dropped all the dead weight. Seriously, we spend a dull 1 hour and 15 minutes tediously beating around the bush before finally fulfilling the damn premise of the movie in killing off Max's wife and son and making him mad, which leaves only 15 minutes of actual vengeance, all of which is shockingly underwhelming. Lame. Granted, The Road Warrior is the obvious standout and shouldn't be overlooked. It is genuinely good, with an appropriately simplistic premise, subtle characters, a far more realised world, and great set pieces, but just when things could have picked up, then Beyond Thunderdome comes about, which is just weird. While it expands on the post-apocalyptic side of things more, it's shockingly inconsistent. There's a point when we go from what seems like Mad Max 3 to The Running Man and then to Peter Pan in the stretch of half an hour. It's certainly an entertaining watch, and while the ultimate saving grace of it all is the finale battle, in retrospect it's just kind of okay. I don't dislike the series, there's just nothing huge there necessarily sticking out to me. One thing I will say I attract to, however, is how the trilogy plays out more like feature-length experiments by George Miller to see how many different ways he can interpret and tell action-driven stories with the established premise and world. And while that may equate to arguably the most inconsistent feeling film series that's ever managed to retain the same director for each installment, it also means that when he decides to do another movie in that universe, say 30 years later, he has complete license to give a huge flying middle finger to the very concept of continuity. And the new sequel/reimagining entry Fury Road is the one that I hope now sets the standard for the rest of the franchise, mainly because it feels like exactly what the series should have been from day one. Nothing other than visceral non-stop motor action supported by complex characters in a simplistic plot that never allows itself to become a dumb one, all surrounded by a unique visual aesthetic that's batshit insane and that never stops being exciting, loud, ridiculous, or strangely attractive. It ups the action, it ups the stakes, it ups the investment, and most importantly, it ups the crazy. You could essentially bullet point its pros to being a bunch of finalies. Say what you will about the previous movies, but I always felt they missed a trick with regards to the theme of insanity. The title is Mad Max, which is so simple and punchy it makes you think you're in for an uncompromising onslaught of exaggerated hardcore loony imagery with mental characters, and while that was certainly a presence in the originals, for the series to truly define itself, that aestheticism was always going to have to get turned up to 11 and take full form to provide Mad Max's biggest selling hook. These movies are f***ing crazy. Seriously, a guy strapped to a truck with tons of amps behind him as he plays a flame-throwing guitar? Yeah, this is it. This is Mad Max. Our story finds us 45 years since the collapse of civilization, where survivors cling to life at a fortress controlled by the tyrannical cult leader Immortan Joe, who controls the water, food, and oil supply which has been scarce ever since the apocalypse. When Max Rockatansky, now played by Tom Hardy, is captured by the War Boys, the army of Immortan Joe, and is designated a universal donor, he quickly finds himself imprisoned and used as a living blood bag for a sickly war boy named Nux. And when Imperator Furiosa, one of Joe's trusted allies, drives her heavily armoured war wig off course, it soon becomes revealed that she's snuck Joe's 5 wives aboard to help them escape. Needless to say, Joe isn't too happy, and it doesn't take him long to lead his entire army in pursuit and in turn drag Max into a fight he had no intention of being in. After various way too specific to explain happenstances occur, Max soon reluctantly teams up with Furiosa and the wives as they agree to let him accompany them on their way to the Green Place, which goes without saying is essentially this movie's version of Utopia. The premise is brilliantly simple in setting the stage for a narrative that calls only for our characters to engage in a super elaborate car chase without getting killed. But because we also have a good filmmaker on hand, the movie knows never to let itself down by means of slow-talking, dragged-out scenes of explanatory exposition. To the contrary, Miller comes from the days when you got all that stuff out through action and character motivation, and it's safe to say that Fury Road not once has an eye-rolling pandering moment where we all sit down to go, okay everyone, this is what's happening. If anything, it's more, we don't have time for this right now, just get in the f***ing car! Skeptical fans of the series can sleep easy knowing that Mad Max 4 seems to have retired the once upon a time inevitable notion that being a sequel or a remake of a classic movie once acclaimed for its visual execution means you instantly have to half-ass the production and do it all via computer-generated imagery to offer the quote modern version because, hey, we're in the future right now and who wants to shoot outside where we could be sitting in a comfy green screen studio? In keeping true to its roots, Miller has crafted a marvel of well-directed high-octane spectacle via, more or less, practical stunt work. Not only does knowing 80% of the effects are genuine instantly transform the world of the film into something incredibly detailed and provide a tangibility you just don't get with sci-fi action thrillers today, but there's a great extra bit of tension that complements that in hoping to God that none of these stunt people died trying to make this picture. Character-wise is where the film surprises the most. In keeping with said crazy aesthetic, this time we're asked to even question Max's mental state as something more than being just kind of moody that his family got axed a few years back. I don't want to hark on Mel Gibson's portrayal, but I always felt he underdid it just a little bit. For what claimed to send him down a dark path, seemed to have very little effect on his actual sanity. Again, based on the double meanings the title has always suggested, this feels like an element which should always have been a little more prominent in the series. I'm hearing some criticise the character's involvement in the story as being more of a side guy, with Theron's Furiosa really being the main protagonist, but then like James Bond or other figures from episodic adventure-based material, Max has always been more of a passenger in his films. There's not much to flesh out there besides reminding us once or twice that he's lost stuff and isn't quite right in the head, and the more interesting elements lie within the characters he bumps into and helps in his numerous journeys. One of the reasons it's so easy to forgive the fact that none of these films feel connected is that they don't really need to, there's no ongoing narrative. Which is also why it didn't bother me when I realised they've also just straight up retconned Max's origin. You'll know what I mean when you see the movie. And while Charlize Theron is terrific as Furiosa, and the four wives are also extremely well handled in the story, with a surprisingly decent performance by Rosie Huntington in particular, I personally think the real standout is Nicholas Hoult as Nux, who grabs that role by the balls and completely runs with it. He's got wonderful charisma throughout. If there's one downside, it does seem slightly uninspired in a narrative sense once we reach the halfway point. I understand that a certain decision made is a quick and easy excuse to have our heroes aim to get from point A to point B just so we can set the stage for the climactic set piece, but there's an undeniable awkwardness that doesn't quite feel right about seeing our characters go from left to right and then left again. It can potentially mess with the iconic visual we often associate with the idea of progression that's become so second nature to us, but perhaps that's a personal thing. Mad Max Fury Road is a special sort of film, an absolute one-of-a-kind rarity. It's an R-rated, in-camera effects-driven celebration of motor action that, surprisingly, never once forgets to be a smart movie with genuine, layered characters you're convinced to care about. That kind of sincerity and attention calls back to the point in time when sci-fi action was a far more respected genre, and this is definitely one for the ages. What a lovely day indeed. Cheers for watching, guys. If you'd like to help support my reviews and other videos, you can by donating to my Patreon account, which would be a massive help towards keeping the content coming, and as always, if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel.